You ever hear one of those stories that makes you stop everything you're doing, where something small and seemingly insignificant suddenly becomes the key to a truth so big, so life-changing, it shatters everything you thought you knew? This is one of those stories. And if you're here, watching this video, you already sense it, that something is about to unfold that will hit you deep. So lean in, because what starts with a tiny birthmark ends with a test result that turns two families upside down. And yes, you're going to get the answer you came for. I'm not just going to tease you for views. I'm going to take you inside a real-life unraveling that's more unbelievable than any movie plot. But here's the deal. You've got to stay with me until the end, because every twist, every reveal, every emotion-packed moment builds to one final truth, one that no one saw coming. And by the time you get there, you won't just know what happened, you'll feel it, like it happened to you. Now, I want you to think about this. Have you ever looked at someone and felt a strange pull? Like a flicker of recognition you couldn't explain? Maybe in a grocery store, maybe in passing on the sidewalk. Your brain shrugs it off, but your gut says, wait a minute, that's exactly what happened to Dr. Marian Keller on an otherwise quiet Wednesday afternoon at St. Luke's Memorial Hospital in Charleston, South Carolina. She wasn't expecting anything unusual when she walked into room 409 to do a standard newborn exam. In fact, she almost skipped it altogether and handed it off to a junior nurse. But something tugged at her, call it intuition, fate, or just that subtle, inexplicable feeling that something was off. And what she saw that day, a simple mark just above a baby's right ankle, stopped her cold. It was a birthmark, a small crescent-shaped one, faint but distinct. Nothing medical to worry about. But to Dr. Keller, it wasn't just a mark, it was a memory. Because 17 years earlier, she'd seen that exact same crescent shape on another newborn. Same placement, same tilt, same slightly jagged edge. She remembered it because back then, that mark had been a bit of an inside joke among the maternity nurses. Looks like a little moon, they said. Maybe this one's destined for NASA. Silly, harmless stuff. But now, here it was again on a baby born to an entirely different family. And that's when Dr. Keller felt it. That drop in her stomach. That silent question pounding in the back of her mind. What if this isn't just a coincidence? I want you to really imagine this moment. You're a doctor. You've delivered thousands of babies. Seen everything from premature twins to miracle births after 20 years of infertility. But you've never seen this. Not twice. Not 17 years apart. Not on two babies who are supposedly unrelated. You're trained to rely on science, facts, numbers. But your gut is telling you something wild. Something that doesn't line up with any chart or protocol. Do you ignore it and move on? Or do you start digging, knowing full well that what you uncover could tear two families apart? This story isn't just about a birthmark. It's about identity, about family, about secrets that were buried for nearly 2 decades. It's about how one quiet observation by a seasoned doctor lit the fuse on a discovery so shocking, it forced two sets of parents to question everything, from the day they brought their baby home to the very nature of what it means to be a parent. And it all comes down to one test. A test Dr. Keller ordered in secret. A test that never should have been necessary, unless something had gone horribly wrong 17 years ago. And let me be clear, this wasn't just some run-of-the-mill hospital mix-up. What she finds, it points to something darker. Something no one wants to believe could happen in a modern hospital in America. So, let's talk about the families. On one side, you have the Martins, a military family, proud, structured, traditional. John Martin is a retired Army sergeant. His wife, Lisa, teaches 2nd grade. Their son, Ethan, just turned 17. Straight A student. Star soccer player. The kind of kid parents brag about at dinner parties. He's the baby Dr. Keller remembered, the one with the original crescent birthmark. But then you have the Monroes, Sarah and Tom. New parents. Young, excited, overwhelmed. They'd struggled to get pregnant for years, went through IVF, finally had their miracle baby girl, whom they named Lila. And here's the part that stings the most. When Dr. Keller saw Lila's birthmark, it wasn't just a déjà vu moment. It was like someone had pressed play on a memory she didn't know was still tucked inside her brain. And from that second forward, she couldn't unsee it. What makes this even more chilling is that Dr. Keller had no reason to connect the dots. Different hospitals, different decades, different cities. But something deep inside wouldn't let it go. She started quietly requesting access to old hospital logs, comparing delivery dates, scanning birth records for any overlaps or anomalies. And just when she was about to give up, thinking maybe she was chasing a ghost, it happened. A match. A name. A timing discrepancy that cracked everything wide open. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, then you already know this isn't just some tabloid twist. This is a real story, grounded in real emotions. It's about people who are forced to make impossible decisions. About mothers who find out the child they raised might not be the one they gave birth to. About fathers who question whether love is blood or something more. And most importantly, it's about how one small detail, a birthmark, ended up being the thread that unraveled a massive truth. Now, I want you to ask yourself something. If you were in Dr. Keller's shoes, would you have made that call? Ordered that DNA test? Would you risk breaking two families apart on nothing but a hunch? Or would you stay silent and let the past stay buried? That decision is coming. And so is the fallout. Because once that test result comes back, there's no going back. The truth is out. The question is, what do you do with it? And that, right there, is where our story takes its first real turn. A result is delivered in a sealed envelope. A nurse is instructed to hand-deliver it to Dr. Keller, who has cleared her schedule for the next 2 hours. She opens the envelope, reads the results once, then again, then slumps into her chair as her entire body goes cold. Her hands begin to shake. Not because the test confirmed her suspicion, but because it uncovered something even worse than she imagined. Something that means this wasn't just a hospital mistake. It was deliberate. And that's where I'll leave you for now. Because what Dr. Keller does next, it's the move that changes everything. Dr. Marianne Keller sat frozen in her office, the crisp white envelope now resting loosely in her lap, its contents refusing to make peace with her racing mind. The DNA results were undeniable. The baby girl born to Sarah and Tom Monroe just days ago was biologically the daughter of John and Lisa Martin. And Ethan Martin, now 17, the boy with the same crescent-shaped birthmark Dr. Keller remembered so vividly, he belonged, at least genetically, to the Monroes. But this wasn't a simple case of a tragic mix-up in the maternity ward. No, it couldn't be. The dates didn't align cleanly, and the hospital logs, especially the older ones, had gaps that shouldn't have existed. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And Dr. Keller, despite all her experience and professionalism, felt the first pang of fear crawling up the back of her neck. Not just fear of what this meant for the families involved, but fear that she herself might have just stumbled into something she was never meant to uncover. Only a few weeks earlier, Dr. Keller's life had felt more grounded than ever. After nearly 3 decades in medicine, she'd stepped away from the exhausting overnight shifts and emergency calls to focus on neonatal consultation and teaching at the medical college nearby. Her reputation as a meticulous, compassionate doctor had earned her the nickname Mama Marianne among staff and students alike. She had no children of her own, something she often brushed off with a wry smile and a self-deprecating joke, but she had helped deliver over 3,000 babies. She'd guided anxious parents through complications, comforted grieving mothers, celebrated miracles. Her world was calm, clinical, reliable. Until now. Her recent return to St. Luke's was only supposed to be temporary, a 6-month fill-in while the hospital searched for a new chief of pediatrics. It felt familiar, like slipping on a well-worn coat. But even then, something about this assignment had felt off. There had been quiet tension in the maternity wing. A few senior nurses had transferred out suddenly, and the newer staff seemed unusually guarded, especially around certain patients. More than once, Marianne had noticed the strange hesitations in chart entries, notes that seemed vague or oddly phrased. When she inquired, she was met with polite deflection or quick explanations about understaffing and digital errors. She wanted to believe them, but now, With this DNA result staring her in the face, every one of those tiny red flags felt like a warning she hadn't heeded in time. Back when Ethan Martin was born, Marianne had been working across town at a different hospital, one that shut down its maternity ward shortly after due to budget cuts and administrative controversy. In fact, that closure had always been a sore point in the local medical community. Rumors swirled back then about a whistleblower, a mismanaged patient file, and a suspicious lawsuit that vanished quietly behind closed doors. At the time, Marianne hadn't given much thought to the details. But now, in this eerie moment of reflection, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to that shutdown than anyone ever let on. She opened her laptop, heart pounding, and pulled up the archived data logs she had requested earlier in the week. Her eyes darted between the timestamps, looking for overlaps. Sure enough, there was something subtle but suspicious, a shift change record that didn't match the newborn intake chart from that night. 2 babies born minutes apart, but no matching wristband scans logged. It was a breach in protocol, so basic it should have triggered an alert. Yet there it was, buried under 17 years of data, dusty and ignored until now. As she dug deeper, more pieces began to crack the surface. One of the attending nurses on duty during Ethan's birth had left the profession completely a few months later. No forwarding address, no further employment in medicine. Another technician involved in the intake process had since relocated to Arizona under a new last name after a quiet divorce and a sealed court case involving hospital-related misconduct. The coincidences were piling up, but Dr. Keller knew better than to label them coincidences. To make matters more complicated, the Martins and the Monroes couldn't have been more different socially and economically, which added another layer of unease. The Martins, with their deep military roots, had always moved in strict, close-knit circles. Dr. Keller had seen families like theirs before, stoic, loyal, protective, sometimes to a fault. Lisa Martin was particularly known in the community for organizing veteran support drives, always poised, always in control. But there was something about her manner, even during prenatal visits, that seemed tense, controlled, as if she were walking a tightrope no one else could see. Meanwhile, the Monroes, while younger and more relaxed on the surface, were still reeling from the long and emotional IVF process that had consumed nearly 5 years of their marriage. Sarah had confided in Marianne during one of their appointments that she often felt like motherhood was a fragile dream she could wake up from at any moment. How would she react when she learned the child she'd waited so long for wasn't biologically hers? And then there was Ethan. Bright, polite, a little reserved. A kid who never got into trouble, who volunteered after school, who took care of his dog like it was his little brother. Marianne had always sensed something slightly unusual about him, not in a bad way, but in that quiet, searching look he had whenever his parents spoke. Like he was waiting for a connection that hadn't quite landed. Could he have known deep down? Could he have felt the truth without ever having the words to explain it? Still, none of this answered the biggest question. Why? Why would anyone switch 2 babies, intentionally or not? If it were accidental, surely it would have come to light by now. Hospitals, even back then, had multiple fail-safes. But if it were deliberate, the implications were chilling. Was it revenge? A cover-up? A misguided attempt to correct something someone saw as unfair? Or was it part of something even more complex? The deeper Dr. Keller dug, the more she realized how little she actually knew about that night 17 years ago. What other files were missing? Who else might have been involved? And why did the hospital's legal department suddenly begin requesting access to patient files she hadn't even mentioned yet? Someone knew. Someone was watching. And someone was afraid she'd find out the whole truth. But the most disturbing piece came the next morning, when Marianne returned to her office and found a small envelope slid under her door. No return name. No logo. Inside was a photograph. An old one, clearly scanned from a printed copy. It showed 2 bassinets, side by side in a dimly lit nursery. The name tags were hard to read, but Dr. Keller recognized the layout. It was the old hospital, the one that shut down, the one where Ethan had been born. On the back of the photo, written in shaky blue ink, were 6 words that made her blood run cold. You're not the only one watching. And just like that, what had begun as a question about a birthmark was now something far more dangerous. Someone else knew the truth, and they were ready to do whatever it took to keep it buried. Dr. Keller barely slept that night. The photograph and its chilling message sat on her kitchen counter like a ghost refusing to leave. Every creak in her old house made her jump. Every car driving past her window felt like a surveillance van. She told herself she was being paranoid, but the truth was, this was no longer a medical anomaly or a paperwork mistake. It was personal. The next morning, she returned to the hospital determined to take action. She had copies of the DNA test and a digital backup of the record she'd flagged. Her plan was to approach the hospital board privately and demand a full internal audit. But when she opened her secure drive to print the files again, her heart dropped into her stomach. The folder was gone. Not just the test results, everything. The DNA logs, the birth record inconsistencies, the employee rosters. Every file she'd painstakingly compiled over the last 2 weeks had been erased. And it hadn't just been deleted. Someone had overwritten the data completely. Even her cloud backup showed a blank entry. It wasn't possible. Not without access to her personal credentials, two-factor authentication, and physical device verification. Unless someone inside the hospital had hacked her directly, this wasn't a breach. It was a message. And it had been delivered by someone who knew what they were doing. Her fingers trembled as she tried to run a recovery scan, but even the utility was disabled. Then her office phone rang. The voice on the other end was low, calm, and unfamiliar. "Let it go, Marianne," the caller said. "This isn't your fight. You're in over your head." No name. No department. No number on the screen. Just private caller, glowing in bold, white letters. Before she could say a word, the line went dead. She stood there for what felt like minutes, listening to the silence that followed, wondering how long they'd been watching her. And then the second blow landed, literally. That afternoon, her car was broken into. Not stolen, not vandalized. Just carefully searched. The glove box was open, papers scattered across the front seat. But nothing of obvious value was taken. Just her backup flash drive, which she'd kept out of habit in the cup holder under her spare stethoscope. A drive no one should have even known about. At this point, Dr. Keller understood what was happening. Someone was actively trying to bury the truth. And whoever they weren't just powerful, they were connected. That night, while nursing a headache and going over what little physical evidence she had left, she decided to revisit someone she hadn't seen in years, Nurse Ellen Whitmore. Ellen had been one of the most senior and respected nurses at the hospital back when Ethan was born. She was sharp, thorough, a little rough around the edges, but deeply loyal to her patients. After the hospital ward closed down, Ellen had vanished from the local medical scene entirely. Rumors claimed she left for family reasons. Others said she had been offered early retirement after a confidential HR settlement. Marianne had always doubted the official story. She tracked Ellen down through an old nursing board registry and found her living alone in a small cabin near Lake Tillman, about 2 hours outside the city. When Marianne arrived unannounced, Ellen was understandably hesitant to talk. But after some coaxing and a shared bottle of strong black coffee, the retired nurse's guard finally began to lower. Ellen stared at the photo Marianne had brought, her expression hardening as if it opened a door she'd slammed shut long ago. "I never wanted to be a part of that night," she said quietly. "But I was. And I regret it every single day." What followed was a confession tangled in heartbreak and fear. Ellen admitted that the night Ethan Martin was born, there had been a last-minute staff change due to a scheduling mix-up. A junior nurse had called out sick, and an unfamiliar replacement was brought in from another facility. That nurse had access to the nursery alone for several minutes while Ellen was in the next room preparing postnatal charts. When she returned, something felt off. The bassinets had been rearranged, and one of the ID bands had clearly been cut and retaped. She reported it immediately to the charge nurse, but the incident was quietly brushed under the rug, written off as a clerical error. The next day, Ellen was reassigned without explanation. Within a month, she was pressured into early retirement with a non-disclosure agreement and a padded severance. They told me I'd be ruining lives if I asked questions, she said. But they were the ones who ruined those lives. I just watched it happen. Marianne asked for names, but Ellen wouldn't, or maybe couldn't, give her one. It wasn't just one person, she said. It was a system. A network. Something bigger than you think. But just as Marianne leaned in to press for more details, Ellen's eyes flicked over Marianne's shoulder to the window. Her face went pale. "You have to leave," she whispered. "Right now." A dark SUV had parked across the dirt road, engines still running, windows tinted. Marianne turned to look, but the moment she did, the vehicle pulled away, slowly, deliberately, before disappearing down the hill. Ellen refused to say another word after that. Marianne returned home shaken. She knew now that this wasn't a simple case of hospital negligence. This was part of something wider, something deeply rooted and deliberate. But even with all the warnings, she couldn't stop. Not now. Not after what Ellen had told her. She began writing everything she remembered into a leather-bound journal. No more digital files. No more traceable records. If someone was watching, they wouldn't find this so easily. And then came the twist she never expected. 2 nights later, as she sat at her desk poring over a printout of hospital staff rosters from 17 years ago, she came across a name that nearly made her drop her pen: Jessica Monroe. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence. But the more she read, the more her blood began to chill. Jessica Monroe had been a medical intern at the very hospital where Ethan was born. She left the program midway through the year citing family issues and disappeared from the state medical registry soon after. But her name, her records, and her image on the archived ID card? It was the same woman now married to Tom Monroe, the supposed mother of the newborn Dr. Keller had just delivered. Marianne's stomach dropped. If Jessica Monroe had worked at the hospital during the exact time of the baby switch, and had then gone on to raise the child she wasn't biologically connected to, what did that mean? Could it have been a mistake? Or was it something else entirely? Was Jessica involved from the very beginning? And if so, who else knew? Dr. Marianne Keller had barely begun processing the shock of seeing Jessica Monroe's name on the old hospital intern roster when her phone lit up with a name she hadn't seen in over a decade: Ben Travers. A forensic analyst she'd dated briefly during her early residency, Ben was now working as a digital security consultant for private medical practices in upstate New York. The last time they spoke was years ago, after a failed attempt to rekindle things, but now his name glowed across her screen like an unexpected lifeline. She answered cautiously, unsure if this was coincidence or something more. "Marianne," Ben's voice cracked through the speaker, tight and urgent. "I don't know what you've gotten yourself into, but you need to be careful. Someone's been in your email. And not just yours. They've accessed archived hospital databases from '06 through '09. I was flagged by an old security protocol we set up back in med school, remember?" He paused for breath. "They're not just watching you. They're looking at everyone you've worked with, including me." Marianne's spine stiffened. The noose was tightening, and whoever was behind this was more sophisticated than she feared. She asked how he knew, and Ben explained that his private network had picked up unusual data packet behavior originating from a subnet traced back to a now-defunct pediatric research clinic, one that had been partially funded by a corporate health conglomerate linked to the same hospital where Ethan was born. Ben wasn't sure what they were looking for, but the moment he noticed her name tied to the access log, he knew it wasn't random. And then he said something that made her pulse throb in her ears. One of the other names on that list was James Martin, Ethan's legal father. It didn't make sense. James Martin had no reason to be involved. The man had spent the last 17 years living a quiet life running a small accounting firm on the edge of town. He and his wife, Jessica, had always presented themselves as the picture of suburban stability. But now, not only was Jessica tied to the hospital as a former intern during the year of the suspected baby switch, her husband's name was somehow tangled in the digital trail left behind by whoever had hacked the records. Either he was being watched, or he had something to hide. That very night, something else happened that made everything spiral further out of control. Dr. Keller received an anonymous package at her doorstep. No return address, just her name typed out on a plain label. Inside was a single object, A pacifier. Not new, not clean. This one was old, clearly from the early 2000s, with a hospital brand imprinted faintly on the plastic. Marianne turned it over and saw faded initials scratched into the underside. Yem. It couldn't be coincidence. It had to belong to Ethan Martin. But how had someone known to send it to her? Was this a threat or a plea for help? Still shaken from the delivery, she decided to confront the Martins directly. But before she could plan her approach, news broke that James Martin had been hospitalized after a sudden collapse during a business trip out of state. The cause? A neurological event triggered by an unknown substance, one that didn't show up on standard talk screens. When local doctors ran further analysis, they found traces of a compound used in experimental sedatives, many of which were being tested in a now-shuttered pharmaceutical trial linked to, of all places, the same pediatric research clinic Ben had flagged. And now, James Martin was in a medically induced coma, unable to answer a single question. As rumors started to swirl in the hospital corridors, another name surfaced: Dr. Lionel Brentwood, a former neonatologist who had abruptly retired the year after Ethan's birth. Dr. Keller remembered him only vaguely, a quiet, methodical physician with a reputation for discretion. But when she tried to pull up his personnel file, she was hit with another red flag. His file had been locked behind executive-level credentials. That kind of access wasn't just restricted, it was classified. And only a handful of board members would have the clearance to authorize it. Now the puzzle was morphing. If Brentwood, Jessica Monroe, and even the comatose James Martin were all tied together in this complex web, then the narrative Marianne thought she was unraveling had just been flipped upside down. Maybe Ethan hadn't just been switched at birth. Maybe his identity had been manipulated, monitored, or even manufactured for reasons she still couldn't comprehend. And if that was true, what was the endgame? While she pieced these theories together, another blow struck, this time through her closest ally. Ben Travers called again, this time breathless and panicked. His home office had been ransacked, his equipment stolen, and worse, a photo had been left behind. A photo of him and Marianne from over a decade ago, folded precisely down the middle, their faces split. On the back was a single message scrawled in red ink: "Some truths stay buried for a reason." Ben was shaken but adamant. "They're not just watching us anymore," he said. "They're cleaning up, erasing everything. And I think we're next." Marianne didn't doubt him. Everything about the case had turned volatile. Information that had once felt like puzzle pieces now resembled a spider web, sticky, overlapping, and stretching out far beyond what any of them had expected. The pacifier, the encrypted records, Jessica Monroe's past, James Martin's collapse, Dr. Brentwood's locked file. None of it added up in a linear way, and yet it all felt connected. And just when she thought she had hit a dead end, a twist appeared that shattered what little certainty remained. A nurse from the NICU wing where she currently worked quietly slipped her a note during a night shift. It read, "He's not the only one." Taped to the back of the note was a tiny photo, grainy, slightly out of focus, but unmistakable. It showed another newborn, from around the same time as Ethan's birth, being held by a man who looked suspiciously like Dr. Brentwood. The child's wristband was just barely visible in the photo, but the initials weren't Yem. They were LW. Suddenly, it wasn't just about Ethan anymore. Dr. Marianne Keller had always prided herself on keeping a clear head, even in the most chaotic ER emergencies, but nothing in her career had prepared her for the feeling of being hunted. For days after receiving the nurse's cryptic note and the photo of the second newborn, her world shifted into something that didn't feel like her own. Every knock at the door made her pulse spike. Every car that parked a second too long outside her townhouse drew her to the blinds with a pounding heart. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was fear, heavy and tangible, something that clung to her skin like cold sweat. The feeling that she was being watched wasn't just in her head, and she had proof. It started subtly, a second set of footsteps echoing too closely behind her during an evening run, the sense that a figure ducked behind a van just as she turned to look. Then, one morning, she walked out to her car and saw that someone had drawn an X on her driver's side window using their finger in the dew. It was gone within minutes of sunlight, but the message had been clear. She was being marked.
And she didn't know why.
She tried to act normal, to carry on with her shifts at the hospital, but something about her daily routine had changed. Her office phone rang late at night with static on the other end. A coworker mentioned casually that someone had asked for her schedule at the front desk, someone they couldn't describe clearly, only that the person seemed too curious for a patient family member. When she checked her emails, 2 drafts she never wrote appeared in her outbox with attached files she'd never seen. One was a compressed zip folder labeled simply, Patient LW, Emergency Authorization. But when she tried to open it, the folder vanished, and her screen went black for a full 10 seconds before rebooting. She reached out to Ben again, only to discover he had gone silent. His number went straight to voicemail, and the security encryption on his messages had been tampered with. At first, she thought he was just laying low after the break-in, maybe trying to protect them both. But then his sister, a public school teacher in Albany, called Mary Ann in tears. Ben hadn't shown up for a family event he never missed. His apartment had been cleared out. Laptop gone. External hard drives gone.
His dog gone.
The only thing left behind was a single envelope pinned to his kitchen corkboard. Inside it was a photo of Marianne, taken 2 days earlier, sitting at a coffee shop alone. The shot had been taken from a high angle through a window, the timestamp visible in the corner. It wasn't just invasive. It was a message, we see you. Marianne's world shrank into paranoia. She began questioning everyone around her, unsure who she could trust. The nurse who passed her the note never showed up for her next shift. HR said she called in to quit, no notice, no explanation. Marianne called the number listed in the employee records, but it had been disconnected. No forwarding address. No emergency contact.
Just gone.
One more person swept into the void this mystery was creating, one more ghost in a web growing larger by the hour. And yet, it was the silence that frightened Mary Ann the most. No demands. No blackmail. No ransom. Whoever was orchestrating this wasn't after money or revenge. They were protecting something. Hiding something. Something that had been buried for nearly 2 decades and had to stay buried no matter the cost. Still, she couldn't let it go. Not when 2 children's identities, Ethan and this unknown LW, were somehow connected to a potentially orchestrated switch. Not when James Martin was still in a coma and Jessica Monroe hadn't returned a single message. Not when Ben, who once told her he never feared death, vanished without a trace. She started compiling everything on paper, refusing to trust her computer anymore. She began sleeping in 2-hour stretches with lights on, locking every window, checking her rearview mirror every time she drove home. It was during one of these late-night strategy sessions that something broke her. She heard a knock at her back door, not the front, but the side entrance that led to her kitchen patio, the one no one used except for her closest friends. She froze, instinctively grabbing the flashlight she now kept within reach. There was no one there, just a small manila envelope taped to the glass. With trembling fingers, she opened it and found something she hadn't seen since her days in med school, a photocopy of an organ donor card. But the name on the card wasn't hers or Ben's or even Ethan's. It was for a child, a newborn. The donor name read, Levi Washington. Blood type, AB-. Date of death, August 24, 2006. Her breath caught in her throat. The initials LW. This wasn't just another child. This was the same infant from the photo, the same child she was beginning to suspect had been at the center of a failed cover-up. But if Levi Washington had died in 2006, why was his name connected to sealed medical files? Why did the hospital still have an open pediatric profile under those same initials as recently as last year? And what did all of this have to do with Ethan Martin, whose birth date was only 2 days apart? As Marianne stared at the donor card, her hands trembling, a new fear rose in her throat. Not just for her life, but for the truth. Because if what she was starting to believe was even remotely accurate, then not only had 2 babies been switched, one may never have been intended to live. And if that's the case, then the most dangerous part of this mystery wasn't what had already happened, it was what someone might still be willing to do to keep it hidden. Marianne stood frozen in the hospital archives room, her breath shallow, her eyes glued to the final folder she had no business opening. It was buried in the back of the restricted files drawer under a false name, labeled as an anonymous maternal transfer. But what lay inside unraveled everything. It wasn't just about a birthmark anymore. It wasn't about a simple baby switch or a hidden donor card. The truth was deeper.
Sicker.
And it began long before Ethan Martin was even born. Tucked between 2 pages of forged patient logs was a photo, an old security still, time-stamped 2006, taken in the NICU ward. In the photo, a woman stood near the incubators, half-turned, her face just clear enough to make out. Marianne's chest constricted as she leaned in closer. It was Jessica Monroe, Ethan's mother. But here's the thing, Jessica didn't give birth until 2007. So why was she in the neonatal ward a full year earlier, registered under an entirely different name? The photo didn't lie. Neither did the visitor pass she wore around her neck, half tucked behind her coat collar. The visitor name tag read Michelle Lane. That name hit Marianne like a truck. Michelle Lane wasn't just anyone. That was the name of a nurse who had gone missing in 2007 during a hospital investigation involving unauthorized access to fetal DNA samples. A nurse who was believed to have fled the country under the radar, or so everyone thought. Marianne had only ever seen a blurry picture of her in an old internal report. But now it made sense. Jessica Monroe, if that was her real name, wasn't just a concerned mother caught in a tragic story. She had been part of it from the beginning. She'd been planted. And suddenly, everything, the nervous way she deflected questions, the avoidance, the silence, it all seemed like guilt. Marianne's hands trembled as she flipped through more documents hidden in the file. There were genetic reports, real ones this time, with matching sequence tags for 2 infants born at almost the same time. One tagged as Baby M, the other as Baby W. But in bold red print, handwritten at the bottom of the page, were 4 chilling words. Viable. Transfer. No witnesses. What kind of transfer? Was it even legal? Who had signed off on it? Before she could process it all, her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A text popped up from an unknown number. No name, no context. Just 3 words. You found her. That was all it said. And it was enough to make Marianne's blood run cold. Moments later, another message came through, this time with an image attachment. It was a live photo, taken just seconds ago, of Marianne standing exactly where she was now, in the archives room. She spun around, heart pounding in her ears, searching for whoever might be watching, but the room was empty. The hallway outside was silent. Someone had eyes on her, from somewhere close, and they wanted her to know they were watching. Marianne backed away from the cabinet and stuffed the folder into her coat, heart racing, mind spiraling. This wasn't just about identity anymore. It was about control. There had been a deliberate hand guiding this from the start, someone with the power to rewrite medical records, erase hospital logs, fake deaths, and disappear people. And somehow Michelle was part of it. She needed answers, but she couldn't go to the police now. Not with what she had. Not with Ben gone, the nurse missing, and her own digital footprint likely compromised. There was only one place left to go, Jessica's house. But when she arrived, the front door was wide open, lights off. No movement, just the faint sound of a music box playing somewhere deep inside. She stepped in slowly, calling out Jessica's name. No response. The house looked untouched, like Jessica had just stepped out to run an errand. But on the coffee table sat a folder, the same kind used in hospital charts, with Marianne's name scrawled across the front in thick black ink. Inside wasn't more evidence. It wasn't medical records. It was photos, dozens of them, of Marianne, taken over years. In her car, at her front door, walking into the hospital. And in the very back of the folder was the most disturbing one yet, a picture of Marianne holding a newborn. Dated 2007. But Marianne had never had children. Or, at least she didn't remember having one. The room began to spin. What if this mystery had always been closer than she realized? What if Mary Ann wasn't just uncovering the truth about someone else's child, but about her own? Mary Ann sat alone in her car, parked in the far corner of the hospital's employee lot, her mind racing through 1,000 fractured memories she could no longer trust. The photo of her holding a baby, dated 2007, haunted her in a way that pierced deeper than fear. It brought on a nauseating kind of confusion, like someone had cracked open her past and rearranged the pieces without her knowing. She kept replaying her own life, trying to spot the moment where reality split and the truth was buried. Was it after her brief medical leave? That unexplained surgery? The foggy months when her mother said she wasn't herself? The lies were so deeply layered, she couldn't even tell which ones she'd told herself to survive. She needed to talk to someone who could help ground her. Someone she trusted. That someone was her sister, Leah. Leah was the only constant in Mary Ann's life. Calm, measured, and brutally honest. She was a social worker, someone who dealt in hard truths and emotional chaos for a living. If anyone could make sense of this, it was her. But when Mary Ann finally showed up at her doorstep, white-knuckling the envelope of surveillance photos and hidden DNA reports, she didn't expect what came next. Leah barely glanced at the folder before backing away, like it was on fire. "You weren't supposed to find that," she whispered. The words didn't register at first. Mary Ann blinked, convinced she'd misheard. "What do you mean? What do you mean I wasn't supposed to, Leah? What do you know?" Leah's face twisted in conflict, her fingers trembling as she motioned for Mary Ann to step inside. Once the door was locked, she collapsed into the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands. "I tried to protect you," she said softly. "God, I really tried. They told me you wouldn't remember. That it would be better if you didn't." Mary Ann's breath caught in her throat. "Who told you?" Leah looked up, eyes bloodshot and rimmed with guilt. "The adoption facilitator. The clinic. I don't know who they really worked for, I just know you were part of a fertility trial. It was experimental. They told us there were complications. That you lost the baby. But then months later, I got this call. They said you'd delivered early. That the baby was viable, but needed to be placed in protective care due to illegal constraints. I signed papers, Mary Ann. I thought I was helping. I thought I was doing what was right." It felt like the room collapsed inward. All the air seemed to vanish as Mary Ann struggled to breathe through the betrayal. Her own sister, her blood, had helped erase a piece of her life. Not out of malice, but out of fear and manipulation. It should have made it easier to forgive. But it didn't. It only made the wound deeper, colder. She realized now that there had never been a clean version of the truth, just layers of half-truths, sanitized explanations, and convenient disappearances. Before Mary Ann could press her further, Leah's phone rang. The screen flashed with a blocked number. Leah hesitated, then answered with shaking hands. A digitally altered voice crackled through the speaker. "If she keeps digging, we go public. All of it." Leah hung up immediately, her face pale as death. "You need to leave.
Now."
They're watching again. I shouldn't have said anything. But Mary Ann wasn't going anywhere. She had reached the point where fear no longer paralyzed her. It fueled her. She demanded answers. She needed names. Who was they? Why had her child been taken? Where was Ethan's real mother? And what exactly had she forgotten or been forced to forget? Leah hesitated, but finally relented, scribbling an address onto a torn receipt. "There's someone who can tell you everything. But going to him means they'll know you're not going to back off. It means they'll come after you." Mary Ann took the paper and stood at the threshold, facing her sister one last time. "I have nothing left to lose," she said quietly. "But I still have something to find." As she drove through the winding roads that led into the rural outskirts of town, the receipt gripped tightly in her hand, another question started to form. One that chilled her deeper than any threat, any conspiracy, any betrayal she had faced so far. What if the child she believed had been taken from her wasn't Ethan? What if there was a second child out there, hidden, protected, or worse, raised under someone else's name? And what if finding one meant sacrificing the other? The gravel cracked under Marianne's tires as she pulled off the narrow road and into what looked like the ruins of an old medical outpost, nothing more than a crumbling concrete shell half swallowed by overgrowth. The place looked dead, forgotten by time. But according to Leah's note, this was where the trail ended. She stepped out of the car, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out the wind. A rusted door hung off its hinges, barely concealing the darkness beyond. As she stepped through it, her phone vibrated once, an anonymous text, "You're already too close." And just like that, the signal cut out. No bars. No GPS. She was on her own. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and silence. But not emptiness. Something about the stillness felt curated, like a set built to deceive. She moved quietly, flashlight in hand, and soon found a hidden corridor masked by a fake wall of medical files and cracked drywall. Behind it, reinforced steel doors stood slightly ajar. She entered slowly, unsure if she was walking into answers or a trap. What lay beyond was nothing she could have imagined. An underground wing, sterile, humming, active. Computers were still on. Lights still flickered. This wasn't abandoned. It was operational. As she crept farther in, past rooms labeled only by numbers and vague terms like Subject C and nutritional compliance, she found herself standing before a monitor cycling through files. Names.
Dates.
Photos. One name made her blood run cold. Ethan Marlowe. Her son. But below his name, another was listed, Marianne Keller, Gen Surrogate Class 7. She stared, frozen. The next file opened automatically, Project Genesis Reentry Protocol, followed by a chilling header, Implanted Memory Therapy, Batch 4B Subjects. And there, listed under Secondary Participants, was her own file. Her entire life had been a manipulation, a carefully managed loop of selective memory, hormone interference, and psychological rewriting. She turned to leave, panic rising, but a voice echoed behind her. "You weren't supposed to make it this far." It was Dr. Brenner, her former supervisor, a man she once trusted. He had mentored her, defended her during disciplinary hearings, hugged her after she returned from medical leave. He stepped forward, his face void of remorse. "You weren't supposed to remember, Marianne. We chose you because you were strong but malleable. Your trauma history made you the perfect candidate. You wanted a child so badly. You accepted the narrative we gave you without question." Marianne stared at him, her entire body trembling. "What are you talking about? You told me I miscarried. You told me there was no hope." "And we were right," he said simply. "There was no hope. Not for your original child. That fetus didn't survive. But your body proved compatible for something bigger. Something revolutionary. You were a prototype, Marianne. And Ethan? Ethan was never biologically yours." The words hit like a sledgehammer. "Then whose child is he?" Brenner sighed. "That's the real question, isn't it?" Suddenly, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Someone else was coming. Marianne turned to flee, but Brenner blocked her path. "You can't leave, Marianne. Not now. You've seen too much." But she had prepared for this. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the flash drive she had stolen from the computer terminal. "I don't need to leave," she said. "I just need to send." She jammed the drive into her portable router, hot-wired through an external satellite signal. The device blinked green. Upload initiated. Brenner's expression darkened. "You think the public will believe this? They'll dismiss it as some fringe internet hoax." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe they'll recognize their own faces in those files." Because what she had discovered wasn't just about her. It wasn't just Ethan. There were hundreds of children, engineered, relocated, reassigned. Families had been silently rearranged under the guise of tragedy and second chances. She had seen the file names, recovered assets, womb lease programs, postnatal erasure trials. It was a full-scale operation. But the worst part wasn't the science, it was the compliance. Nurses,
Clerks.
law enforcement officers, even Leah, all recruited or coerced, told they were saving lives, preserving stability, protecting national interests. It wasn't a black market operation. It was bigger. government-adjacent, corporate-funded, sanitized with just enough legality to keep the real consequences buried. As she sprinted out the exit tunnel with the device blinking green in her hand, she realized the betrayal went deeper than she'd thought. Leah hadn't just signed forms, she'd helped monitor Marianne post-reintegration. Her most trusted ally had been her handler. And now, with the truth surfacing, Marianne knew she'd become the most hunted woman in the country. She couldn't go back to her old life. There was no old life, only a past that had been edited and a future that depended on what she did next. But the next question was even darker. If Ethan wasn't hers and never had been, who was she really fighting for? The night was colder than it had any right to be, considering the firestorm building inside Marianne as she approached the abandoned church tucked deep in the outskirts of Maine, where coordinates from the last decrypted file had led her. The building had long since been stripped of its spiritual sanctity, now a hidden base dressed in relics and shadows, the perfect place for secrets to live and die. Her boots echoed down the cracked stone aisle as she walked beneath stained glass windows that looked down like forgotten gods. She wasn't alone. She could feel it, eyes in the dark, breath held behind walls, and most of all, him. Dr. Brenner. She had come for answers. But she was ready for war. The heavy wooden doors behind her slammed shut, sealing her fate as a figure emerged from the sacristy. It wasn't Brenner. It was Leah.
Calm. Composed.
Wearing the same gray cardigan she wore the day she handed Marianne her test results and told her she had a healthy baby boy. "You shouldn't have come here," she said softly, almost sadly. "This could have ended differently." Marianne clenched her fists, holding back the weight of betrayal choking her. "Don't pretend you were trying to protect me. You knew. You knew everything." Leah's eyes flickered with something close to regret. "I didn't know at first. I only learned the full scope after you had bonded with Ethan. By then, it was too late. You were in too deep. And so was I." Behind them, Brenner finally entered, slow and casual, like a man walking into a theater to enjoy the third act of his favorite tragedy. "She's right, Marianne. You were never the villain here. You were the proof. Proof that love can be engineered. That family isn't biology, it's behavior. And you proved it beautifully. You passed every test." "I'm not your damn experiment," she snarled, stepping closer. "But you are," Brenner said, his voice ice. "And so is Ethan. He was one of the first viable genome merges. A hybrid of 3 donors, memory mapped with a customized behavioral scaffold. He's not your son because he wasn't born to you. He was assigned to you." Marianne's world tilted again, but she refused to collapse. "Then what about the birthmark? The one that led me to all this? How do you explain that?" Brenner chuckled. "A mistake. An insignificant anomaly. A simple patch of pigmented skin we hadn't accounted for. The irony? That imperfection became the thread you couldn't stop pulling. If we had caught it earlier, we'd be having this conversation in a padded room instead of this lovely sanctuary." "But you made one mistake too," Marianne said, stepping toward the altar, where she placed her phone on the pulpit. "You forgot I wasn't just your subject. I was your student, and I learned everything I needed from you." Brenner raised an eyebrow. "What are you doing?" "I'm live streaming this," she said. "And I already sent the files to every major news outlet in the country. Ethan's medical history, the birth logs, the video footage, the audio confessions. All of it. You'll never bury this again." Leah moved toward her, panic etched across her face. "Marianne, you don't understand. If this gets out, it won't just expose us. It'll collapse everything. Every family that was part of the program, hundreds of people, will be torn apart. The truth will destroy lives." "They were never real lives to begin with if they were built on lies," Marianne said, her voice breaking. "And the only thing I understand is that my son, whatever he is, however he got here, deserves to live free from your manipulation." The room grew still. But before anyone could react, the building jolted violently. Explosives. Somewhere underground, the base had been rigged. Emergency alarms pierced the silence, red lights flashing across stained glass as hidden doors burst open and armed guards poured in. chaos erupted. Marianne ducked behind a pew, pulling Leah down with her. "Did you know about this?" she shouted over the deafening sirens. "No," Leah cried. This wasn't part of the plan. They scrambled as the structure trembled. Brenner was already gone, slipped away in the chaos like a phantom. Marianne grabbed her bag and bolted through the side corridor, sprinting toward the rear exit. Behind her, the church groaned and cracked. But she didn't look back. She couldn't. Outside, the cold hit like a slap. She made it to her car just as the building behind her erupted in flame and debris, the explosion sending stained glass raining across the night like Technicolor shrapnel. The fire lit up the forest as sirens approached from every direction. Police. Fire. News vans. She had tipped the first domino, and now there was no turning back. But just as she reached for her phone to check on the stream, it buzzed again. A message. No sender. Just a number. One she recognized. Her own medical ID from the clinic, followed by coordinates. She stared at it, stunned. This wasn't over. She'd exposed one facility, one layer of truth. But that message meant there was another, deeper, older, more protected. And someone out there wanted her to keep going. Marianne looked into the rearview mirror, where Ethan sat quietly, clutching the stuffed bear she gave him when he turned 5. He looked up at her with eyes that were unmistakably hers. And in that moment, she realized the final twist. The birthmark wasn't the error. He wasn't the experiment. She was. Weeks later, the ash had long since settled, but Marianne still woke up some nights expecting to smell smoke. The media storm had come and gone in violent waves, each broadcast flashing her face across the country. Whistleblower exposes genetic engineering ring, mother or subject. The woman who took down Eden Prime. And yet, despite the saturation of headlines, the true story had managed to stay elusive. Some pieces were intentionally omitted by government redactions, others buried beneath legal threats or ongoing investigations. Still, the files she'd leaked made their rounds across YouTube and TikTok, with creators breaking down the data frame by frame, stitching together wild theories, and diving into terms like genetic memory, CRISPR child engineering, and bioidentity fraud. Hashtags like #EdenFiles, #SyntheticSun, and #DesignerBabyScandal trended for weeks. But none of them really knew. Not the influencers, not the journalists, not even the federal agents who raided the second facility only to find it scrubbed, emptied, as if it had never existed. Marianne had answers now, but peace was something else entirely. Some nights, when Ethan was asleep, she sat by the window, sipping cold coffee and watching the neighborhood lights flicker on and off like quiet signals. She would think about the other families, the ones unknowingly caught in the same experiment. Some had reached out anonymously, voices trembling on voicemail recordings, asking if their child's quirks meant something deeper. Others sent threats, blaming her for the chaos that followed. But the worst were the ones who remained silent. The ones who might never learn the truth. And sometimes, she wondered if that was the real cruelty, knowing the truth and having to carry it alone. Leah's fate remained uncertain. She'd vanished after the fire, her name never appearing in any official report. Marianne believed she was alive, maybe in hiding, maybe working to expose the next layer from the shadows. As for Brenner, sightings were reported from Dubai, then Argentina, then nowhere. Ghost trails, likely planted to confuse anyone still hunting him. The man who had controlled so many lives had become just another mystery in the wind. And yet, Marianne had this unshakable feeling he was still watching, still waiting. She kept the phone that sent her the last message locked in a drawer beneath her son's baby photos. She'd never followed the second set of coordinates. Not yet. Part of her wanted to, but another part, the part that had grown used to sleeping with one eye open, understood that some answers came with a cost she wasn't ready to pay. Not again. Not while Ethan was still smiling at cartoons in the morning and asking about dinosaurs at bedtime. For now, he was happy. He was safe. And that meant she'd done something right. One crisp Sunday morning, she took Ethan to the same beach where she used to go as a child, back when her world was still whole. He ran along the shoreline chasing seagulls, his laughter unburdened by science or secrets. She watched him from the dunes, wondering if his mind would ever unlock memories that weren't his, or if his DNA would always carry the whisper of someone else's design. But even as those fears haunted the edges of her thoughts, a quiet voice inside reminded her that he was still hers. Not because of genetics, not because of blood, but because when she held him that very first time, he chose her too. As the wind picked up and the sun dipped lower, Marian closed her eyes, breathing in the salt and sea and sound. The story was over, for now. But the questions it left behind? Those would echo for years. How far should science go in rewriting life? What makes someone truly human? And who decides where the line gets drawn between innovation and playing God? Somewhere, buried beneath those questions, was the truth. The real kind. The kind that doesn't trend or stream or fit neatly into a headline. The kind you live with. And maybe that was enough.